Hello everybody, welcome to ChinFat. In this episode I'm going to be getting into Premiere Pro's color correction features. This is going to be a bit of a long and kind of in-depth explanation of color correction and using the scopes and color correction theory and whatnot. So everybody get ready to get into the comments and post a bunch of really nasty comments about how I should just get to the point, because I'm not going to just get to the point. I'm going to get in depth here. So yeah. All right, so what we've got here is I've got all my audio muted because I don't want to really mess with audio right now, but I'm going to go up here and I'm going to hit color under the arrangements. By the way, if you have some old settings in here where these are not displaying, you can just go up to Window, go to Workspaces, and hit color as well. It's the same thing as this bar right here, but when you hit color there, so when you hit color, you'll notice it kind of gets this color arrangement laid out so you can start working on color correction and color grading. I'm going to move this down a little bit so we can just work with the video here. What we've got here is two special windows that kind of show up is this Lumetri Scope panel here and then this Lumetri Color panel over here. This is where pretty much all the changes are done to your clips here. And what happens with it when you're in this color layout, as soon as you start moving the playhead, you'll notice it selects a clip. So now this clip is selected and it's getting ready for changes to be done to it. And then once you do a change, I'm just going to do a quick exposure slider on this. I'm going to slide that over and show you what happens. I'm going to move over to the effects controls and you'll notice it has added the Lumetri Color effect to this actual clip. If you got the clip selected, and you're on effects controls up here, it'll display all the effects that have been added to this specific clip that is selected. And what you'll notice as we move the playhead to another clip here, it automatically selects the clip that the playhead is over. And actually what it's done, if you go up under sequence, it has checkmarked this automatically for you. This layout has checkmarked selection follows playhead. This kind of makes things a little bit quicker as you're grading. You don't have to select a clip and then start grading it. You just move your mouse over, you move your playhead over a clip, and it automatically selects that clip, and then you can start grading. And look right now under effects controls, notice no effect has been added, but watch what happens once I start moving a slider up here and changing something. There you go, it just added that Lumetri Color panel. And all the numerical values of what you're doing in this panel shows up under this Lumetri Color effect right there. So watch as I drag this back and forth, you'll notice my exposure is changing right there. The numerical version is changing right there. This is more the visual slider, making it very convenient to change this the values numerically, just with a visual, just with this visual interface over here. So I'm going to delete that effect right there. Just hit delete. I'm going to select it and go to this clip that I had it on as well, and I'm going to select that clip, select that Lumetri Color, and delete it so we can kind of start from scratch here. What I'm going to do in this tutorial is, first of all, we're going to go through scopes, then we're going to go through the panel and how you make the changes, and then I will go into the goal with color correction theory and show what you're going to try to do when you're color grading an entire project. So let's hit the scopes first. I'm going to move my mouse over this and hit tilde so it goes full screen, and let's talk about each one of these. A couple of these, in my opinion, are fairly worthless. If you go into something like DaVinci Resolve, you do have what is called a histogram. You do have a histogram inside of DaVinci Resolve, but it's a much better functioning histogram than the one is in Premiere, in my opinion. I hardly ever use this histogram inside of Premiere just because I think it is kind of useless, because it is this vertical histogram as opposed to this a horizontal histogram. And the DaVinci Resolve one actually shows the red channel, green channel, blue channel, where you can obviously see the differences. On this, it shows a red channel, green channel, and blue channel, and then your Luma channel, like all meshed together, and it's really kind of tough to tell what's what in this. So I'm going to actually, to get rid of scopes, you just right click, and I'm going to go down to histogram and uncheck it. Like I said, I think that, in my opinion, I think it's useless. And I'm going to go over to this one, and now you'll notice a couple other things here. One thing that I'm not going to really be covering is this right here. This scope here is called what Premiere calls the HLS vector scope. This is a vector scope, and this is a vector scope. And once again, this I consider somewhat of a useless vector scope. The ones that are most commonly used are these vector scopes right here, which is basically what Premiere calls their YUV vector scope. In the industry, these are commonly referred to as just a vector scope. They've added this when they brought over when they started using speed grade years ago, which has now been end of lifed basically. But they have borrowed the scope from speed grade, and once again, I hardly ever see this used in the industry. In fact, I've even done some research online, and I can't for the life of me figure out how this thing actually functions. I have a little bit of a disclaimer there, but I guess guess I'm not putting enough energy into it, but you do not see this in the standard color correction software that you see on the market right now, especially DaVinci Resolve. Sorry, I keep comparing it to DaVinci Resolve, but I'm going to right click and I'm going to get rid of the HLS vector scope because we are just going to be using the standard vector scope. So these are the three most, in my opinion, these are the three most useful scopes that you have inside of Premiere Pro. You've got what's called your waveform down here, and you've got your RGB parade up here, and your vector scope right here. You don't have to have these displayed on the screen all at once. You can right click and uncheck these or check mark them. But right now I'm going to uncheck my vector scope, YUV. I'm going to uncheck my parade RGB, and we're left with our waveform monitor. I'm going to right click on this as well because I want to change the nature of this. Right now this is considered what they call an RGB waveform, and this is somewhat useful, the RGB mode, but I really like using the waveform for Luma levels, or what's called tone levels. So to get rid of the RGB, by the way, to explain RGB, you've got red, green, and blue. When you're working with a video channel, when you're working with any video channel, you have three different channels that are mixed together, composited into one final image. You have your red channel, your green channel, and your blue channel. And the cameras that you use record in those three different channels and blend them together to create and with different brightness levels in the reds and the greens and in the blues, you get literally millions of different colors that create an image. So I'm going to right click on this, and I'm going to go down to waveform type, and I'm going to tell this just to show Luma. So this is a typical waveform now, showing just the Luma channel. This is your brightness, your waveform under the Luma settings is basically just a scope representing tone or brightness. You'll hear several different words used for that. The typical word in color grading is actually called tone, and tone equals basically your Luma or brightness levels, and pretty much minus the color. You don't need to necessarily worry about the color in this instance. We're working just with brightness. And if you move over here to the Lumetri tab here on the side, you'll notice under tone you've got these features: exposure, contrast, highlights, shadows, whites, blacks. These don't really don't have anything to do with color. Once again, these deal with tone. When you hear skin tone is not referring to the color of skin. It is referring to the brightness level of the skin, whether the skin is dark, whether the skin is light. If you right click on this here, because nearly everybody has, and I know I'm going to get into some weird territory here, so please don't come after me yet, but skin color pretty much has the same color when you're working with color correction. Everybody has the same color, the hue that's coming off of their skin for the most part, because they have blood under the skin, and blood reflects kind of a reddish color. And we'll show this later as we get under the vector scope. Under a vector scope, you'll see skin color and hue kind of going off between yellow and red, because that's kind of the color of blood that's under the skin and putting forth that color. But then when you get into skin tone is basically going to be how dark the skin is, how light the skin is, and that's going to be reflected in this area here on your waveform. All right, to kind of prove that a little bit, what I've got here in my timeline is a picture of two different people. We have, yes, this person and this person. I want to show you a couple different things here as we select this clip here, and we're going to just choose the skin tones. We're going to show a secondary color correction later on down the line, but right now I just want to show a quick demonstration of the reddish hue that I'm talking about that's in skin. I'm going to select this eyedropper here, and we're going to select the skin a little bit right there, drag it across some of the skin, and I'm going to go to the color mat here, show the skin that we're grabbing. Let's drag that out a little bit, and get more of the skin colors. And look at what hue we've got here. The hue that's left over in the skin that's showing right there goes to a reddish hue right there. So we've got, so the skin is a reddish hue. However, tone deals with how dark or light the skin is. As we move over to the next clip here, let's select this one, do the same thing, grab the eyedropper, drag it across the skin here, and select a range of the skin, go to our color gray, here, and let's choose a little bit more of the skin colors, drag this out and get more of that, and there we go. Look how we have a very similar skin there. We got some going off toward the, I guess, orange range, sorry, but mainly red there. We got a red hue, kind of the skin hue there. So when we are talking about skin tone, we are talking about darkness or brightness. We're talking about Luma brightness levels, dark, bright, gray, kind of, not necessarily including color hue. Now, how the waveform works is this is basically a reflection of your image from left to right or from right to left. On this side, you'll notice what's called an IRE, what they call an IRE scale. The IRE scale basically goes from 0 to 100. It goes up a little higher than that to show like overexposure, but the kind of danger points are here at 100 and 0. Let's move to an image that's kind of a little bit brighter here, and you'll notice what we get is a larger spread on our contrast, but also from left to right. So I'm going to move over to this shot where we've got kind of the overexposed sky right here. So what we've got on this scale here is we've got, as we mentioned, from 0 to 100 on the IRE scale. 0 basically is where your darks exist. And what happens at 0 is details in your video signal disappear, or they're kind of crushed out around 0 on the IRE scale. And as you move up to 100, 100 is where details crush or disappear on the whites in your image. So the 0 is your darks, the 100 is your whites, and this is also represents detail loss right here at 100. And now, kind of the mid-range, the best exposure level kind of exists in this area right here. This is an area that's kind of, I guess you could say, a little more properly exposed. So between 40 and 50 are considered basically what they call your midtones. This is where your grays or your midtones exist right here. So as we look at this image to the right here, what we've got is we've got this kind of sky that's overexposed and these mountains that are kind of they're properly exposed there, and that's what most of this stuff is right here that you're seeing in that mid-range are these mountains right here. From the left-hand side of your screen, notice we have a little bit less, and it gets a little bit bigger over here. That's because, look, we've got a little bit of mountains. As we move over to the right, we got a lot of mountains right there on your image. And this little peak right here represents that sky right there. That is a 80 IRE, so this is almost so the sky is almost completely overexposed. If it hits 100, it loses detail. So in theory, we should be able to restore a little bit of the blue to the sky by bringing down the highlights, which we'll get into a little bit later. And notice that this sky goes from here and moves over about 2/3 of the way over to the screen, and same over here, it moves about 2/3 of the way over, and it's gone. So that's how this scope works and how that's represented. And you can see as we play through it, how it changes and how it updates with the movement of the screen. As we have like a less sky or more sky, as this camera pans around, you'll see the changes happening reflected over here on your scope. To move to this shot right here, without even looking at this, I can already look over here and see that most of my signal is below 40 IRE. That tells me, just looking at this, that my shot is kind of overexposed. If we grab our exposure and we drag that up and we get that kind of in the mid-range there, now we have a lot of pixels that are in the 40 to 60 range, and now we're starting to see a little bit better exposure. We do have some highlights over here, which is probably on the branches, showing a little bit of too much overexposure. We're going to show you how to fix all this stuff. As we move to our first clip here, once again, this is a nicely exposed image. We got a lot of stuff in the mids there, some stuff in the darks, which are kind of in the shadows, and a little bit in the highlights, which is kind of the brightness color, the brights on the rocks here. So let's go to the next scope. All right, this here is called an RGB parade. And why they call it a parade is it basically has 3 waveforms. It has a red waveform, a green waveform, and a blue waveform. This is exactly the same thing that we were looking at before, brightness levels, but this here from left to right of the red, that includes the full red channel and full waveform there for the red channel. This is specifically for the green channel, and this here is specifically for the blue channel. So from left to right, we have in the red channel, we have a waveform showing the darkness and brightness levels of the red channel, the brightness and darkness level in the greens, and the brightness and darkness levels in the blues. And right now, you'll notice that all 3 of these look like they're fairly on the same level. If they are, then this is what is considered a fairly balanced shot, meaning the colors, when you look at it, should look accurate to what they looked like when it was actually shot. So the reds are probably being represented in this, the blues and the greens are as well. And as you change different things over here, as we add more blue to this, you'll notice now we've got a bigger boost in the blues and the highlights, and the reds have been suppressed, and the greens are about in the middle there, and we have what looks like a fairly blue shot. If we take this the other way and go to the reds, notice it boosts up the reds. If we reset that and do the green channel, give this more of a green presence, you'll notice the green boosts up more. But as you get these fairly even here, then you're going to have what's considered a balanced shot. The shot starts to look a little bit more accurately color balanced. And let's move to a shot here that maybe looks a little off color. Right here, this shot right here looks like, if you look at the image, it looks like it's got a little bit too much blue in it. If we look at our RGB parade here, we got the red, which is a little bit below the green, and then we got the green, which is kind of boosted up in the highlights here, and then you got the blue. And look at this signal right here where the person's standing. It's like everything's going to be kind of pushed up on the blue, including the highlights. Everything is like too blue in this shot. So if we're going to balance this here, and we're going to get into this in details later. I just want to show how the scope works. But if we remove some of those blues there and bring it down and maybe bring the green up a little bit more. Now we look at the shot. Let's look at a before and after here. I'm going to go to Effect Controls and turn this Lumetri color effect on and off. There's before. There's after. We have more of a properly balanced shot. So basically what this parade is being used for is it's showing the brightness levels again. So we are working with tone, but it shows how those tones are affected in each individual color channel. And this is where we want to do what's called balancing a shot. And to balance a shot makes it look accurate, makes it look like the way it should when you shot it, which isn't always necessarily true, because if you're shooting a blue sky, the sky should look blue, but if you don't have much but just the blue sky in it, then you are going to have a natural push in the blue channels as opposed to the other two channels. But typically speaking, when you're looking at most normal shots that have a wide range of colors and images in it, this is going to represent more of what we call a balanced shot. Next, we're going to show the vector scope. And I'm just going to refer to this as vector scope. They call it the vector scope YUV, but this is more commonly referred to as just a vector scope. So I'm going to open up the vector scope and let's look at this. What a vector scope is used for is to measure a couple different things. Basically, on a base level, it does show hue. It shows kind of a color balance and hue, showing which color direction you've got in this image. What this is basically a representation of your reds, your yellows, your greens, your cyans, your blues, and your magentas. And this is also used to measure saturation. And saturation is basically saying, well, okay, we've got red, but how much red do we have in this? We've got cyan, and how much cyan do we have in that? It's basically showing how strong or how intense those colors are in your image. So right here in the middle point, we've got what's called desaturation. At this point, the image is like there's no color at this little cross section, little midpoint right here. There's no saturation at this point. And then as we start pushing out, these are going to be what we called recommended saturation limits. And out here are actually broadcast saturation limits for HD out at these points out there. But these ones, Premiere recommends that you keep your saturation within this line right here. That's the recommended saturation limit point. So as we go out here and we grab our saturation and we boost it, notice how this spreads out and we get the saturation kind of starting to hit these warning points. I'd say it's sometimes about like the half point is starting to get into an area where your image is going to be way too saturated. But if we grab this and now look at the image, this is obviously too saturated, and of course it's hitting those warning points. But as we grab our saturation and drag this in, watch what happens to that scale there. It just sucks in to the midpoint until it is completely desaturated. And now this image here is black and white. So if we undo that there, double click on this dot and it'll return it back to normal, back to its neutral state. And we look at this here. So this image here has some heavy saturation points going off to the reds, a little bit kind of over toward yellow, and it has some going off towards cyan. If we look at that, the cyan is probably coming from the shirt, and the reds are probably coming from some of the rock and the background area there. And we also have that rope color there as well. So you can see some of the images, but the red does not have a really heavy concentration. It has a heavier concentration between red and yellow, but that's like at a normal kind of saturation limit there. So this kind of tells you if you need to draw back the saturation on specific items in a shot, and we will get into that. But those are the three main scopes that I use inside of Premiere to do to really get an accurate idea of what you're doing to your image and what the colors are, especially when it comes to matching shot and getting everything to kind of look consistent throughout your project. You're going to use the scopes and your eyeballs to get a good idea of what's going to look good, generally speaking. And as you start getting into color grading, you're going to notice things like these wheels down here. But you'll notice that this wheel here, the color wheel, matches the same color scheme as this vector scope. This vector scope is measuring colors based on the red, greens, and blues, and then kind of these colors in between with the yellows, cyans, and magentas. And you'll see those things like right there, you see the yellows and the reds, and up here you see the yellows and the reds, and so on. So as you start grading and you start grabbing your midtones and dragging them over to the blues, you'll see your vector scope changing and updating, and as you drag them into the same direction, you'll see a push over into those areas there. So that's kind of the portion on scopes. Let's start getting into the panel over here on this side and what all these functions do in here. I'm going to close that there. Over in the Lumetri panel, you have these basic categories. You got basic correction, creative, curves, colors, wheels, and match, HSL secondary, and vignette. Let's go over each one of these. First of all, basic correction. I'm going to select that, and that expands this menu here. And under that, you've got your input LUTs, white balance, and tone, and at the bottom you got saturation. So you've got all those different categories within the basic correction. Input LUT is if you're using a specific camera. If you're using something that usually shoots log, you can install different type of log presets, which will take an image that looks fairly flat and give it kind of a pre-calibrated look to it. We're not going to really go through this right now, but if you're shooting in a specific camera format, you can download these LUTs online in different places. You can browse and add those here and just select them. So I'm going to reset this clip here. I'm going to remove attributes and take off the Lumetri color panel there. But as we pull down these LUTs and you click on different ones of these here, you're going to see usually a lot of contrast added to them because, like I said, this is used for cameras that shoot in log. So if I click on one of these, it's going to change it as you go into different types of cameras here. So I'm going to go to Effect Controls. We're going to delete that. We're going to move down to the white balance. So right now, there's the original shot. This one, as we mentioned, was a little bit on the blue side. I'm going to right-click and on my scopes over here and add the parade to demonstrate white balance. I'm just going to use the RGB parade and kind of show what's happening here. First of all, you have your temperature slider and your tint slider under white balance. This little eyedrop here, you can actually, if you can find something white in the image, you can click on this and this will give you a good starting point. There's not really anything like white in here. I guess that rock a little bit, but you can go and click on some pixels here and it will try to, see, it did detect that there was a heavy amount of blue in there, so it adjusted these sliders here to kind of try to white balance this to get your shot balanced. I'm going to undo that though, and I'm going to show you what these sliders do here, but we can look on our RGB parade and see that this one, it has a higher push in the greens and the blues. So we've got a blue and red slider up here, and they put these up here because these are kind of opposite colors here. They kind of, as you pull it over to blue, it's going to remove the reds. As you pull it to red, it's going to remove the blues. So this looks too blue, so if I grab this and start dragging it over to the red, you're going to see that blue channel dropping and adding more red. Down below, you've got the green and magenta slider, and we see that the green isn't quite up to the same level as the blue and the red, especially in the highlights. So we can grab our tint slider, which is basically green and magenta, which are also opposite colors. Oftentimes in front of green screens, people will use magenta gel on their backlights just to kind of kill the green spill on the subject. So those are literally opposite colors there. As we grab this and drag it this way, you'll notice that's boosting the greens in the shot, and you can see the greens being boosted up, or if you drag it toward the magenta, it's suppressing the greens. So if we want to get that kind of balance, we'll bring the greens up, and we have a fairly balanced shot. Down below that, you have your tone, and your tone is going to adjust, once again, what tone is basically brightness levels or luma levels. I'm going to right click, go to our waveform and get rid of my RGB parade, and let's work on brightness levels here. Once again, 0 is where your details disappear in the darks, 100 is where your details disappear in the highlights or in the whites. And as you go from 0 to 100, it's going from dark to grays to white at the top. Now, the way Premiere works with tone is basically your exposure kind of affects the region between around 40 to 60 in your mids. That's kind of the exposure area. I'm going to skip contrast, going on to highlights. Highlights are going to affect the region pretty much from like 60 to 80. And then whites are going to affect 80 to 100. And now if you go down lower, below exposure, which kind of starts around 40, your shadows are going to affect the regions around 40 to 20. And then your blacks are going to affect the region from 20 to 0. And that's approximate. That's just kind of what you'll see that as you're adjusting. So this shot looks kind of generally a little bit overexposed. I do have some stuff pushing up into the 80s here, mainly probably off the shirt and some of the rocks and skin there. So I'm going to grab my exposure and I'm going to turn this down a little bit. And you can see we bring back a little bit of detail by doing so. Now if you grab highlights, right here, this does not have many highlights because it's not looking up at the sky. But you'll notice as I move highlights back and forth, it's affecting mainly the top. Exposure was affecting the middle, highlights kind of the top, and then as you go to whites, it's going to affect the very tippy top of your image there. And eventually as you drag that up, it's going to start stretching the rest of it. Now blacks are going to do the very bottom of the scale there, and shadows are going to affect just above the black region there. So that's the way these tone sliders work. You have a lot of control over controlling your exposure. One thing that you can really do is work with contrast. Once you get your exposure set, what contrast does is makes it look a little bit more filmic, because what it does is separates the highlights, makes makes them further apart from the darks. Watch as I grab contrast and I slide it to the right. Look at the waveform there. It is stretching the highlights away from the darks. It's making them go further apart. And then look at the difference you get in the image here. You get more definition. And that's what kind of helps give it a little bit more of a cinematic look, is by adding a bit of contrast. You don't have to go nuts with it, but it helps your shot not look so flat. And the reason why they call it flat, watch when I drag it to the left and kill contrast, this waveform gets flatter, and look at the difference in the image that we've got there. So there's with contrast, there's without contrast. And you can see the difference in the look. As we go to the bottom, we've got our saturation slider here. Let's bring up our vector scope and kind of show what saturation does. We've already kind of shown that, but as we boost saturation, you'll notice those colors get more exaggerated and they grow out towards these regions here. As we drag that back the other way, it kills saturation. As you drag it all the way over the left, it makes it completely desaturated. Everything's going into a fine point here, and the image is in black and white. Notice my waveform here, that it hardly affects the waveform. It has a little bit of difference kind of changing on there, but the difference is fairly insignificant there. It's what the saturation does, because this is mainly a tone reader, not necessarily a saturation or color reader, the waveform. Now say we want to get something back to normal. Say we boosted the saturation and we want to get this back to its default. All you have to do is go over this dot and you double click, and it resets this value back to normal. And you can do that to any of these here. On your contrast, double click, and it will reset these individual parameters back to their original defaults. You can also do that by going up to this little reset effect, and this will reset the entire panel. And now everything, I clicked on that, now everything in this Lumetri panel has reset back to 0. Everything's the way it was when it started. And that's basically how that works. So let's close our basic correction and we'll go to creative. I kind of wish that they would put this one as the very last feature on here, because this is usually what people do as the last step of color grading, is you'll give your shot a special look. Now these are already pre-created color correction presets that they've installed into Premiere. If you pull down a look, it has different types of camera looks, different types of contrast looks, a whole bunch of different features you can choose here, and you can even find some online, and you can download them and you can hit browse and install them into your Premiere Pro as well. If you want to see some of these, all you have to do is choose these arrows. This whole list right here, what the arrows do is as you click on them, it's going to toggle through this through these looks that are in this list here from beginning to end. So let's hit the arrow left, and it's going to show what these different looks look like. I'm going to tilt it over this so we have a bigger screen you can kind of see. So let's arrow through this and find one that we like. We haven't corrected this shot yet, so it's still looking a little too bluish, but say we find something that we really like maybe that look. All you have to do is click on it, and it adds that look to your image. And if you don't like how strong that comes in, you can grab the intensity and slide it down. So let's reset that. Everything's back to normal. Also down under the creative tab is adjustments. You'll have the faded film look. And the faded film look here, what we've got is, this basically is a contrast killer. It tries to make it look kind of like old faded film. As you drag it over to the right, you'll get kind of this faded film look. Another thing they have is sharpen. Sharpen will sharpen your pixels. Usually this is helpful if you just sharpen it just a little bit, just to make the edges of your pixels a little sharpened. Just makes it look a little bit more crisp. Then we move down and we've got vibrance. What vibrance does is it basically changes the lower saturated colors with less effect on the higher saturation colors. So it kind of maintains a higher saturation. So if you grab your saturation and drag it up, it's boosting all the saturation of everything up. But say you already have part of the image, like right here, you have some of the blues that's already saturated. It grabs the lower level saturation colors and boosts them up instead of boosting the ones that are already high. So it's kind of a little bit more, gives you a little bit more control over the saturation tool, because the saturation actually just boosts everything in the entire shot, and you can kind of see that on our vector scope over there. And watch what happens when we do vibrance here. As we drag it up, notice it's kind of boosting just the lower end here and leaving the higher end alone. Then you have also some basic adjustments, and these adjustments are really there for adjusting the LUT that you installed. And down here you have shadow tint and highlight tint. Usually people try to kind of pull out some of the blues out of the darks and the highlights, and you might do that by grabbing one of these sliders here and just dragging it up toward the reds, which just affects mainly the shadows. And we're coming up here and doing it to the highlights, or you might even want to add blue to the highlights and pull out the blues in the darks. And it's just another tool that you have, which is affecting your look that you've added. Then you have the tint balance to change the color of the tint of your shot there, to kind of cool it off or to warm it up as well. And that's just more adjustments for the lookup table for the LUT or the look that you've added to your clip. I'm going to close that, get rid of the Lumetri look on that, and go down to the next one. Curves. This is where you have a lot of power. And with the curves, what you've got here is you start off with this box, and you've got this line right here. This is where you have a lot of specific control over the tone of your shot, or over a very specific color channel as well. You can do it for the overall tone, and that's what these little nodes up here stand for. The white is your overall tone. That's why it's white. It just basically represents the brightness level. Then if you click on the red, now you're going to be changing specifically just the tone in the red channels. And then if you hit green, it'll affect just the tone in the green channels, and the blue, the tone in the blue channels as well, whatever one you select. So I'm going to select this first one, the white here. And the way this works, let me bring up our waveform scope. Get rid of our vector scope here and look at our waveform, because as we're affecting tone, since we're going to be working mainly with tone here. Now you've got two nodes. You have a node down here at the bottom left-hand corner, and you have a node up here in the top right-hand corner. The reason why they call this a curve is because you can add nodes, and it will change your tone based on a curve. So what we've got down here in the bottom left-hand corner, this is what I call, this is kind of what you would call your darks manipulating node down here. This affects your darks, and this affects your highlights right here, this node up here. And everything in between goes from dark all the way on up to your highlights. So down here is in the middle portion is your mids, or your grays. And now we have kind of our exaggeration point areas. This is your highlight exaggeration area, and this is the dark exaggeration area down here. I kind of coined that. I kind of call it that just myself to help people understand it. As we grab this dark node here and we drag that up, look at the waveform monitor and look what we're doing to the darks. It is bringing the darks up, because this is the dark node and we're boosting it up, and this is the lower section down here. So if we pull this node down and drag it over this way, it'll start crushing those darks. And look at the waveform, look what it's doing there. If we go up the highlight node, same here. If we drag it to the right, it will brighten them more and start crushing the details in the highlights. If we grab this and drag it down, it'll bring those down to the darks until it's just everything's completely black. Now if we go here in the middle, if we want to boost exposure here, you can go in the middle, you can add a node exactly in the middle, and we drag this up to exaggerate them, it boosts the exposure. If we drag it this way, it brings down the exposure. And it treats this on a curve, so it kind of gradually affects all these darks as well, except but not beyond this node here, and the same up here. Keeps these nodes exactly where they are, the highlights defined where they are, and the darks defined where they are, but it gradually decreases your darks until it gets to the mids and so on up to the highlights, or increases them if you pull them this direction. And I'm going to double click on this node here, and it resets everything, but it resets that node and it gets rid of that node. But what I can do here is we can also create contrast. As we showed you contrast, where it was pulling the darks down, the highlights up to make it more contrasty, you can add a node down here in the darks, one up here in the highlights, and we can decrease our darks and increase our highlights, and you get a lot of strength in contrast here. Now there's a really heavy contrasty image right there, and this is called an S-curve. That's how you kind of create contrast without crushing your darks and without crushing your highlights. It's you work it out on this S-curve here. Now if we want to move over to the red channel, the green channel, or the blue channel here, let's go to our parade, and we can see that this has, get rid of the waveform, and we can see that this has a high push in the blues, and the blues are actually peaking out at 100 IRE. So I'm going to drag this node right here, the blue node, and I'm going to drag that down. And notice how it's just controlling the highlights. We're not bringing everything down, but we're bringing the blues down from the top. Let me kind of let's kill the contrast on this a little bit. It's a little too contrasty. And we're also going to go to basic correction, bring the exposure down so we can kind of see what we're doing here. And now I'll go back to curves. We brought the blues down. I'm going to bring them down even further. I'm going to select blue and bring down the blues even further there, get those kind of where they need to be. You can select on the green and bring the greens down as well. And you can even do color contrast in here by adding an S-curve on those as well, but not entirely necessary. And let's look where the subject is standing, kind of in this region here, and see we've got a little bit of boost on the greens, so we can grab that and bring the greens down. Look how much power we have with just these curves here. Quite a powerful tool. Now as we move down, we've got hue saturation curves here. Now this is what would be called hue versus saturation, basically. You can select specific colors, and you can bring down or bring up the saturation in a very specific color vector. I'm going to right click on here and go to our vector scope. And as we look at our vector scope, because we've got a big push toward the cyan, and we've got a bit of a push toward the kind of between red yellow there on the skin color line right there. And that's probably dealing a lot with the skin color of this fellow right here. Remember how we said the blood under the skin kind of creates this almost right on that exact line there, where everybody will share kind of the same skin color, but not the same skin tone. As I move down here to this, we can select, let's start working on the cyan here. Let's go down and we can select our cyan button here, click on that, and what that will do is it will add 3 nodes. And it adds these 2 nodes, so the rest of the color wheel stays exactly the same. And as you drag it this direction, it's going to desaturate that specific color. As you drag it this way, it will increase saturation. And you look at our vector scope there and see how it does it on that cyan line there. But I'm noticing it's just doing it a little bit to the side here. It's not doing it right over here. So what we could do is reset that. Let's go back to our cyan, and I'm going to grab this and drag it out a little further and drag this one and move it in and see if I can kind of nail those colors. And there we go. I nailed that color right there. Now I'm decreasing that cyan. You can see the cyan's decreased there, and I can drag it out here and increase the saturation on that cyan scale there. And you see that the cyan is actually right there in the shirt. That's the color of the shirt. So you can see that decrease. And look at this as we get it desaturated, saps it almost all color. And we can move this around and see where that is. But this is just something usually used to just kind of decrease or increase the saturation just in a very specific color vector. And you can do that with any of these colors and experiment with them. Like you can do it with the leaves in the trees or the blue in the sky and see what you get. And you can actually choose, let's double click reset that. You can actually choose a range of colors by going, let's go cyan and blue. And it puts nodes on the cyan and blue, and now you can really start figuring out where that shirt exists and what you need to do to get that shirt to not bleed so much or to increase the saturation in that blue area. Moving on to color wheels and match. Under this panel here, they've got some cool little features. This is kind of just different tools for doing some of the things that we've already been able to do under basic correction, but something with just a little bit more control, kind of like the curves here. It's just a different tool. What you've got under color wheels and match, let's describe these down here first, and then we'll come up here and talk about color matching. This is kind of a cool little feature that they've added into Premiere Pro for the 2018 updates. Down here, you've got 3 wheels. You've got hue wheels. These are the hue wheels here that affect basic color temperature in the shadows, in the midtones, and in the highlights. And then you also have tone sliders next to it. So this is just another way to affect your tone. You can affect your tone in your shadows, your midtones, and your highlights. As we grab our shadows here, so when we drag them up and down, you can see it's mainly affecting the lower region down here on the tone or the brightness levels of those 3 color channels. If we had the waveform, it would show the white waveform. It would show all the brightness levels for the entire shot. But here we're just, since I've got this chart up there, we're just showing it on here. The midtones, you'll notice it starts affecting the exposure area in the middle of your image. And then as you do the highlights, let's double click on that and reset it. The highlights, you'll see it's affecting the tone in mainly your highlights. You'll see it is affecting the tone mainly in the highlights of the image. You can see that kind of stretching in this upper region there. And then you have your hue, you have your shadows. You can kind of blue up the shadows a little bit or warm them up. And this is going to mainly affect the shadows first until you drag it all the way over. Then it will start affecting the entire image. But you'll notice that it's affecting it mainly in the shadows right there. The midtones are going to be kind of once again, the 40 to 60 region. And as we move that up, that's going to warm them up. That's going to cool them down or make them green or make them magenta, whatever region you decide to drag them. Once this little area in the middle kind of disappears and it fills in with color, that means that this has been affected. So you notice that these things have been changed. If that color solid has filled in, if you double click and reset it back to normal, now you got that wide open circle there. And similar on the tone, as you move tone, it turns that little node blue. So you know this has been changed, and that's been changed, and that's been changed by either the blue here or the filled in circle. So double click and back to white, double click, and back to normal. Now the color match feature is kind of cool here. What you can do is correct an image. Let's move to this shot right here, and we're going to do some quick adjustment on it. I'm going to bring down the exposure a little bit, and I'm going to bring down the saturation a little bit. We've got quite a bit of saturation, so bring down the overall saturation. And it looks like it's got kind of a bigger push in kind of reds there, so we can kind of cool this off a little bit there. And after we've done some adjustments on that clip there, let's go to this clip. And we want, as we play through from this clip to the next, they're an obvious mismatch in color tone and contrast and whatnot. So what we're going to do is go to this color wheels and match here. And this is going to look, what this really does is if you got this check mark right here, face detection, it's going to look for matching the skin color from one face to the next here. So I'm going to come up here and hit the comparison view so it has something to compare. Right now, this is the shot that it's going to be correcting. And it's got a mini timeline here that has your entire timeline from down here embedded up into this window here. So you can kind of move through, and this will jump between edits right here. If you hit this arrow, it'll jump to the right to the edits or to the left of the edits. And I know this is about like and I know that this is the shot that we want to compare it to is about 2 minutes and 4 seconds into it. You can actually click in here and do 204 00 for the frame holder, the frames there, and hit enter, and it will jump to that shot. There it is. So let's get this where we see kind of that lady's face there. So you can see the skin colors. There we go. And what we want to do is we want to match this one closer to that one. So we can go over here now that we've got this viewer up, and I'm going to hit apply match. And it will try to borrow the tone from and it will try to borrow the hue from this color and adjust these color wheels to match this shot. Let's give it a try. Apply match. And there it goes. And did a really good job, actually. This one looks a lot more like that one. And now you can actually do the fine-tuning and tweaking here if you wish, but that is a really good point to start from. And what you've got here with this comparison view, if you move over to your window here, you've got the side-by-side view. You have a vertical split, which splits it right down the middle there. And right there, the split doesn't work because these need to be kind of rearranged. So you can go over here and swap them. And there we go. And now you can compare them to see if they look close. And now I can see she's a little bit brighter than he is, so I could go and fix exposure. But you've also got a horizontal reference as well. So just depending on the type of shot, and then you can swap this as well. So it's got those 3 different viewers and then the swap sides there. But I kind of like the side by side. And that comparison viewer is really helpful. It's one they added into the 2018 updates. Next, let's go to the HSL secondaries. This is a very powerful tool that's added to the Lumetri color panel. The difference between primary color correction and secondary color correction. Primary color correction is when you're correcting the overall image. It's called the global image. It corrects everything. If you add blues to it, it adds it to the entire image. Or if you do anything else to it, it does it to the entire image. What the secondary does is it will just correct a certain portion of your image based on these 3 things right here. HSL, hue, saturation, and luminance. Hue, first of all, is just like the basic kind of color that it has based on that on these colors over here: red, yellow, green, cyan, blue, magenta. And you see that range of colors all throughout this little slider here down at the bottom. So those are your hues right there. Now over this little middle point lands right there, now you can correct it. You can select a portion of your image based on saturation. Right now it's in that kind of like a teal area there. So right now the saturation is kind of that teal color. And then luminance. Notice how this goes from, and the saturation slider goes from kind of desaturated all the way up to full saturation. And now the luminance here is based on how dark that teal color is, on up to how white how bright that teal color is. Well, and I'm just saying teal because it's right now, so it's on that color right there. Well, what you can do is, let's say we want to bring out the blues in the sky, but we don't want to bring out the blues. We don't want to make this rock blue. First of all, we just did basic correction and make that sky blue. We could go up to our temperature slider here and drag that over to blue. Now look how blue the sky is, but of course it's changed everything else as well, and that is primary color correction, so that doesn't work. So let's go down to our HSL secondary, and we're going to choose the sky based on hue, saturation, and luminance. And you do that, you start that by grabbing this little eyedropper here, moving it over to the image, and you select a portion of this blue. Now I clicked on that and notice it selected a little range of blue here, and what you've got here, this little diagonal slide right here, is where it kind of falls off of that, and it kind of feathers off of this portion of blue and feathers off on this portion, and then this solid region here is the region that's selecting that blue area there. And it's done that with saturation and luminance as well. If we go down here to this little pull down, you can tell it to show what you've selected based on color and gray. Let's check mark this, and it will show that I've selected this portion over here. Gray is what's being left out and is what's not going to be touched. And this blue right here, it left in color, is the region that it's selecting. You can also do this by color in black and color in white, just so you see what you have. The white is now the region that is selected, and the black is the part that it will not touch. And if you do color black, of course it does color here, and then black showing the stuff that's being left out. Color gray is pretty common. It just depends on what your preference is. If you really need an absolute, color black or color white is the way to go. Now if we need to increase that range of hue, what we can do is grab this little top triangle here, and you can drag it, and it will widen out the blue. And I let go, and now it's like accepting all these colors here, and it hasn't changed the mask very much. So I'm going to undo that, hit Control Z. And you can change the feather off as well, but it doesn't look like it's really changing the mask based on hue. My guess is it's going to do it mainly on luminance and maybe a bit on saturation. So let's grab this and expand the saturation of that blue. And notice how it's changed this bar down here to kind of blue. As we drag that across, it is starting to get more, but look at this. It's starting to get it into the mountains. And the reason why is because that blue sky is kind of reflecting a little bit of blue color on the mountains. Because this over here is in the shade and this is in the sunlight, so this has a little bit more blue to it than this mountainside does here. So I'm going to pull that down until I get rid of the mountain because I don't want that, but it is grabbing a wide range of the sky blue here. And now if we grab luminance, now look at that. Now it starts eating into the clouds there. It starts eating into the kind of the blue filtering through the clouds. But we want those clouds to stay white, and we want this sky to be blue. So I'm going to kind of back that off a bit, maybe right there, and feather this off a little bit. Feather it into the clouds. So now that I've selected that portion there, we've got a couple other little tools down here to kind of refine the edges of your matte here. So the denoise feature is really helpful if you're using compressed footage. This is red footage, so it's not going to be as bad, but if you're using compressed DSLR footage or something, it would help to kind of drag this across and denoise it a little bit because of the compression noise. Now what the blur is going to do is it's going to kind of soften the edges here. If we grab this, watch as I drag it over. And if you drag the blur slide over, you can kind of see what it's doing. If I drag it way over, that's going to be way too soft. But if you back that off a little bit, usually you just pull it over just a little bit, just to slightly soften the edge so it's just not so hard edged. I'll drag it over maybe about right there. Now you can mark this. And now you have your correction features down here that work with the second, that works with just that mask right there, with this mask that we've selected right there. So as we grab this wheel here, this is a hue wheel, we can grab this and we can start dragging it over to the blue. And now look at the sky. What happens to the sky as I drag that over? It's becoming more bluish. Now if you go up to your basic correction, you can still do the basic correction on the entire shot here. We can change the exposure a bit. We can add some contrast to this image. We can mess with we can warm up the shot a little bit as well if we want to warm that up. And that doesn't really affect necessarily this secondary down here. The secondary, let's check mark that and see if the mask still looks the same. See, and it looks fairly same. It did affect it up here a little bit, so it does kind of do this downstream effect. So I'd suggest doing your basic correction before you do your secondary, but it's still doing a pretty good job there. We can change the luminance there and grab more, and there we go. But yeah, this is a really cool feature where we can bring out the blues in the sky or the greens in the leaves, or even desaturate something that we don't want in the shot. And we can go down here and we mess with all these sliders you recognize from a previous basic correction tab. That you can now have a temperature slider and a tint slider, contrast slider, sharpen and saturation. You also have a luminance slider right here, and if you want to, you can even click the three-wheel shadows, midtones, and highlights function here. If you just do the single, it's just basically the midtones. If you hit the three-wheel, you've got control in the shadows, highlights, and in the midtones. And then the sliders on the side here, this is the luminance. As we bring this down here, you'll notice, see, look what it's doing to the sky there. That brightens the sky, and then this makes it a little darker. If you want a deeper, darker blue, there you go. So secondary color correction is a pretty cool feature that they have here. I'm going to go down to Vignette, and this is the last one. This one's a little bit cheesy. If you're working on something like DaVinci Resolve, this would be the equivalent of like doing power windows, but it only has, the limitation of the vignette is it only has one shape, and it's just basically a circle shape. But as we grab the amount here and we drag it to the left, look what happens. It adds this kind of darkened vignette around the outside of your image here. If we grab our feather here and turn this on, you'll see what it's really doing. It's creating this dark shape around the edge, and then you kind of feather it off to just kind of add a little bit of emphasis to whatever may be in the middle of the shot. Let's grab this feather and turn it down, and you can see what's happening with these other shapes. Midpoint changes where you want how large you want the circle to be, and roundness changes from oval to circle, and so on, depending on what aspect ratio you're working with. So you feather that off a little bit and make it just kind of subtle. Usually vignettes are just kind of used in a subtle manner, but if we check mark this here, you can kind of see the before and after. It adds a little bit of kind of highlight to this section, makes it look like the lighting's kind of different here. And sometimes on moving shots, you can really notice a vignette, and if you're on a static shot, you don't notice it as much. So there's before and after. And one other thing you've got here is with the vignette, if you take the amount down to minus, it does the dark. If you take it up to the plus, it does a highlight, almost kind of like a dreamy sort of look there. So let me undo that. And those are the features that they have. That's how to use the features inside the Lumetri color panel. So what I want to do next is kind of move into the process of color grading an actual project. So let's open up a project, and we're going to show you how that in the next step here. All right, for the third part, I'm going to show you guys how to do an actual kind of color correction. We've got a project here that's been edited, and I'm going to start going through and doing color grading on it. So I'm going to select color, of course, arrange for color, and I'm going to move my playhead here, and it selects the first clip. So I'm going to go to Lumetri Scopes here. On the first process, I always like to start working with tone before I start getting into color. So I'm going to open up my waveform and turn off the other scopes. And now if we take a look at it here, we've got our IRE scale here, and we can see that our image looks, it's like it's fairly dark. Most of the pixels look like it's kind of below 40 there, big heavy concentration. And looking at the shot, it does look like it's a little bit underexposed. So a couple things that you want to do is you want to make sure that your highlights are not hitting 100 and they're not peaking. This one it's not. You got a little bit of crush from that light right here on the side, but it's but it looks like it's around like between 80 and 90 IRE here. So it's not totally losing detail according to my waveform here. So let's go under basic correction and we'll start messing with this a little bit. But I want to define the darker regions a little bit as darkness here. But first of all, let's bring the exposure up. Let's fix the exposure a bit. Bring that up, and that's starting to look better. Now we're starting to get some of those pixels here in the mid range, and we got a good exposure on the face. Then I'm going to mess with the whites a little bit, the tippy top of the scale, and see if you want those whites to really pop. I'm going to bring them right up to 100. I don't want to crush them around 100 too much, or it's going to blow them out too much, but just to define those a little bit. Now we can grab our darks. I want my darks that are above 10. Usually want your darks somewhere around like 5 IRE. It just really depends on what you're doing, but you don't want to touch on 0. If they're on 0, you're going to bring them up. So right now I'm going to bring the blacks, which is the bottom of the scale here. I'm going to grab that and drag it to the left till it's about hitting around 5 IRE. And let's take a look at our before and after and check my basic correction. There's before, there's after, and I'm liking that. So once I get that set, I might want to do a little bit of contrast to this. So let's grab our contrast and drag that to the right and spread apart the highlights and the lowlights there and get a little bit of contrast. But I'm noticing it's kind of crushing my white, so I'll back that off a little bit and bring those back down. And there we go, maybe a little bit more exposure, and I like that. Okay, let's work on our color balance. So first of all, I worked on tone, got the tone exactly where I wanted to, and now I'm going to right click and go to RGB Parade. Take away my light waveform here. If you're working on 2 monitors, by the way, you can just have one full monitor with all your scopes up, so you're not sitting here right-clicking and changing your scopes constantly. I'm just doing it so you can see the scopes a little bit better. Looking at these here, it looks like it's got a bit of a push in the red, and looking at the lowlights, look at the pattern down here, how the red is higher than the blue. So this is looking more reddish than it is bluish. So I might correct that a little bit by grabbing my temperature slider and dragging it over to the blue. And notice what it's doing, that my blue already has some peaking highlights here. So maybe I don't want to do that. I could use a little bit more control by using the curves here. So I'm going to double click, clear that, and go to curves. And under curves here, I'm going to select my reds. I'm going to select my red here, and I'm going to grab kind of like around maybe 50 or 40 here, maybe in the mid region right about here, and bring that down. And notice how that just drops a little bit of red out of that image there in the mids. Let's look at it before and after. There's before. There's after, and that has chilled out the red a little bit. That's looking better. And now I'm going to go to blue because it looks like it's just peaking at the very tip there. So hit blue. I'm going to put a point here in the middle so it doesn't touch the middle part, and then I'm going to pull this down just to kill that at the top. And look at that little tippy top of the blue just come down off the top there. So now it's not crushing so much. Okay, so my first step I did tone. My second step I worked with balance, and it looks like it's kind of crushing a little bit on the blue and the green. So I could actually go to curves and bring up the blue scale on the bottom a teeny bit and and then I could go to green and bring up the green, so they're kind of hitting around 5 IRE as well. And that pulled a little bit of green and blue out of the shadows there, so that's looking pretty good. I like that. All right, so the third thing I'm going to work on is saturation. I'm going to right click and go to Vector Scope YUV here and look at my vector scope and look at the blooming saturation that I've got in this image. Some of the saturation is almost to these limits here, and really where I'm seeing that is especially in the skin color here. In the skin color, once again, we're getting it in the skin, and also look at this right here. We're getting it right here, a big peak of red right there. That looks very, very saturated to me. So first of all, I'm going to work on global saturation. Maybe we can bring the saturation down overall. So I'm going to grab saturation and just drag it back a little bit and make a little less saturation. I don't want to take too much color out of it. It's the reds that's bleeding, not everything else. I brought the general saturation down. Now we're going to go to curves. And under curves, we can go down and we can see if we can do it with this. If not, we can do it with the secondary. But let's try it with this first. Actually, I might try both just to see what we get. But this is going off right toward the red. So I'm going to click on red down here, and it creates these 3 nodes there. And I'm going to grab this middle one and drag it downwards. And let's see if it's actually taking, and look at that on the vector scope. It is actually sucking that red in there. So I'm going to drag that down. Maybe not too much, just a little bit, just so it's not peaking so badly. So let me show you undo. Watch the red here when I hit undo. See that red glow? And then I'm going to redo, and watch this, and see what it did there. It just killed that, so it's just not blooming red. We still have a nice red color there, but it's not blooming red. Let's go up to our effect controls, and here is the Lumetri panel. Here's the Lumetri effect for this clip that I just fixed. Let's hit the effects and turn it off and on, and look at the difference there. Look what we've done to this shot and how it looks so much better. And we might even want to kind of finish up by going down and going to vignette and adding just a little teeny vignette around the corner here. And, oh, let's drag it to the left a little bit. Just darken these edges here, just a teeny bit. So watch this. There's before and there's after, and look at the difference. It makes it look like it kind of falls off into the dark back here and adds a little bit more depth to it. So as we play through this, it cuts from one shot to the next. And now we're going to work on this shot here. So the next shot. So let's go to our scopes and let's go to our waveform, and we're going to work on tone, and we're going to repeat this process. Let me go through this one more time here, the step process. Let's bring up the exposure a little bit. Looks like kind of my mids are kind of need to be brought up on her a little bit. I'm going to bring that up just a little bit till those whites. Now I don't even have to increase the whites. Those whites are kind of getting there where they're popping a little bit. And let's get our darks and bring those down a little bit. And see, I don't want to bring them down too much, maybe right about there. And that one actually looks pretty good. And now we're going to add a little bit of contrast, stretch those out a bit, and make it a little contrasty. Here's before, and there's after, so that looks pretty good. And now I'm going to right click, and I'm going to go to RGB parade. And let's look at the color balance next. And on this one, it's very similar. It looks like the red color. Looks like the red's a little dominant over the blue. So I'm going to go to curves. I'm just going to skip right to curves this time because this has colors stretching all the way from top to bottom. So I'm going to go to reds, and I'm going to bring down the reds a little bit in the mid somewhere. Let's see what this does. Right about there. And it looks like the greens are also kind of up there as well. So I'm going to select green and just bring down the mids in the green and get this thing so it looks a little more balanced. And that's looking a little bit better there. So look at before and after, and we've taken a lot of that red hue out of there. So the next we're going to work on saturation a bit. So let's go to our vector scope, look at our saturation. We got kind of a bloom toward the red and toward the yellow here. So we can probably just correct this, and it's not too bad, not a heavy concentration. So we can probably just go to basic correction and bring the saturation down just a little bit. And there we go. Let's see if that looks like it matches as it plays from one clip to the next. Looks like this shot has a little bit more magenta in it, and those two aren't matching perfectly. It looks like this one has a little bit more green in it, and then as it goes to the next shot, this one has a little bit more magenta. So I kind of decided which one I want to go with. Do I want to go with this shot and pull out the green, or go with this shot and keep the magenta? What we can do is we can go to our comparison view, which is this little icon right there. If you don't have this little icon, you can hit plus and grab your comparison view and drag it and drop it down here, which I already have. So I'm going to hit cancel. I'm going to hit comparison view. And it brings up this little side-by-side thing that we showed you before, where we have the clip that we are correcting, and then we have our little timeline viewer here. We can skip through this and get to the clip that we want to compare it to. Let's move this in a little bit because that fade in happens, and let her get to this point there. Let me move my mouse over, hit tilde so we can kind of compare these two. Like I said, this looks like it's got a little bit of a greenish into it, and this has a little bit of magenta. So actually on this clip, we could kill the magenta a little bit and take this toward the green just a teeny bit, and then go to this clip and move the viewer here, the comparison viewer, to the next clip. And then let's put a little bit more magenta in this one, so we're kind of meeting in the middle a little bit. And there we go. Those look pretty matched there. That looks pretty good. So now I can turn the comparison view off and play through and see how it looks. And play through and see how it looks. Now she stands up, does the cut, and they look like they're matching a lot more. Just so you get the process down here, I'm going to cover it one more quick time. If you have to, or if you want to skip forward past this, you can, but I'm going to go through this one more time just to kind of solidify this. So once again, waveform, work on tone first. The exposure looks a little bit low, so I'm going to bring up the exposure here. So it brightens up the face. I can bring up the whites here, so it's barely meeting. I'd say if you got whites that are crushing, you grab the whites and drag them down so it goes below 100 IRE. As we grab the darks, we're going to find darks here and bring it down a little bit, right around 5 IRE. That's a little too much, right about there. Then we're going to work on color balance, bring up our RGB, and looks like we got some prominent red there. So we're going to go under curves. Like I said, you can usually get away with it by using your little white balance slider up here, but if that's not working, if it's not, like I said, I've got a large spread here where you got stuff at the bottom and the top, so it kind of makes this, when you drag it to the, if you start adding more blue, it's kind of crushing the blues at the top. So usually you can use this to do your basic balance, but in this instance, I do have to use curves. Go to red. I'm going to bring the red down a little bit, right around this region, to kind of get those matched up, and now look at the difference. Here's before, after. That's looking good. And I like the balance on that. The green is kind of bottoming out there, so I'm going to grab the green and bring up the green channel just a little bit at the bottom. There we go, and then bring it down in the mids just a teeny bit to get that balanced. And there we go. Let's go to our saturation now on our vector scope. Our vector scope, we got this big poke of yellow that's poking out here. So, and I'm not sure what that is. I'm looking for something yellow in there. It might be that little light right there. Let's do this. I'm going to go down to the bottom and select my yellow and bring that back and see. And that is killing that little spike of yellow that we have there. We could just kind of bring down the general saturation as well. Right about there maybe. That looks good. And I did forget to do some contrast on this, so let's add a little bit of contrast. And that kind of brings down the exposure in the mids. Go to curves, use the white here, and just bring up, let's do this where we just see it bringing up on our face. Right about there. And now I need to bring the exposure down just a little bit. There we go. Now as we cut from one shot to the next, and then just add a little bit of a vignette. Just a subtle one right about there. And now let's play through. It cuts from this shot. Then add a little bit of vignette here. Kind of darken up those edges a little bit. And as we play through from one shot to the next, something a little bit different. So once again, let's look at our comparison view and look at the colors here. This looks like it's got maybe a little too much magenta, so I can just kill that a little bit by going to basic correction and adding it for the opposite from. And it looks like I need a little bit more blue in it. And there we go. That looks like it's matching a bit more. So as we play through that, let's turn off the comparison view. As we play through it, see if it looks like it matches from shot to shot. Okay, to do the rest of this, you don't have to grade every single individual shot. If you have shots that it cuts away, then it cuts back to the shot that's exactly the same. Like as if we arrow down here, let's move down to this shot right here. This one we've already graded it right here on the timeline. So we don't have to redo this thing all over from scratch. What we can do is move down to this clip here, go up to the effect controls, select the Lumetri color panel, select the Lumetri color effect, do Control C or Command C and copy it, move down to this clip and do Command V selected and paste it. And there we go. And that's finished. And I can do that throughout the entire project and copy and paste on shots that are exactly the same. And then even if you copy and paste it and it's not exactly the same, you can go over here and tweak it a little bit till you get it just right. And that is the basic process of doing color grading in Premiere Pro. There's one more thing you can kind of do to finalize it. Is often used as a technique with color grading. And it is we'll be adding a look to your entire scene. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to move down to my project window. Let me tilde over this so I can bring it full screen. And I hit on my new item here and hit New Adjustment Layer. I hit OK, and it creates an adjustment layer, generates an adjustment layer into my project window. So what I'm going to do with that adjustment layer is I'm going to drag it up. I'm going to drop it on my timeline. And this is just one scene here, but I'm just going to drag it over the entire scene. You can also drag it over your entire movie if you wish. And now what this adjustment layer is going to do is it's going to affect everything below it. So we've already done the color grading on the stuff down below. So now I can go up to my creative panel. And I can arrow through this. I've got this selected, so it's going to add that look to everything below it. Now I can find a look that I like. I can arrow through this and find something that I like. And let's say I like that look right there. It's this Fuji Kodak look here. So all I have to do is single click on this, and it adds that look to the adjustment layer, which affects everything below it. So as I go from shot to shot, you can see that look's been added there. And if we don't like that, if it's too intense, we can take the intensity down there, so it's just maybe about like 65% or so. And add the faded film look a little bit, sharpen the image a little bit, and maybe boost the vibrance. I don't know, just some things to adjust that adjustment layer. So if we turn this adjustment layer off, it turns it off for the entire grade there. Let's intensify it more, just so you kind of see what it's doing there. Turn it on and off, and there's our look for our movie. We still kind of have that contrast, but we have this faded film look as well. We've got a unique look for our entire project. Now you can do this scene by scene, or you can do it for the entire movie and give it a different look for each scene after you've done your basic color grading. So that's it on the process. Those are the basics of color grading inside of Premiere Pro. If you have any questions, please post them, let me know. And if you want to stick around and watch at the end, I will post this little edit here that we use in the example, and you watch this little short film. So thanks for watching. Bye.